The third and final type of interview I want to talk about is system design. And the idea here is that you're given an open-ended prompt from the interviewer, for example, design Twitter or design a link shortener. And then your job in the interview is to decompose the problem into something that you can actually talk about and think about the trade-offs of how would you, high level, design a system, draw boxes, draw arrows, and figure out the relationship between the different components. Right off the bat, what you can tell from the description I just said is you are not coding. This is not a DSA, data structure algorithm problem, where you're writing a block of code and running it in the browser or in a compiler. If you're coding, then you are failing. So the idea of system design is to deliberately keep it high level and talk about the trade-offs of different approaches and not to actually implement anything. Another really common failure mode I see here is that people will read about, this big company is using Kafka, or they're using, this data infrastructure, or here's how they adopted this new open source technology to solve a problem. The system design interview is not about throwing out these hot new technologies or frameworks or open source tools. It's about how are you communicating the different options available to you? What are the assumptions that you're making about where the system might scale or break, and defending the decisions that you're making? So don't try and memorize the hot new frameworks that are coming out. Instead, focus on the actual problem being asked and think about what are the interesting design decisions on how this system might be built at a larger company. And I will say this is a pretty hard problem because when you think about preparation, most people, especially early in their career, have a really hard time preparing. You don't really do system design in school. You're not building large-scale systems as a college student. If you're building a side project, again, you're usually not thinking about 100,000, a million, or 10 million users. You're usually doing something kind of in a sandbox environment. And third, even if you are on a job at a big tech company, if you're more junior, you're usually operating at the task level. Okay, here's a particular feature, write some code and implement it. And you don't really have the autonomy or authority to design a large scale system, for example, at the scale of Twitter or Facebook. And so how do you prepare? My number one piece of advice here is figure out really smart people who you can work with and figure out how are they designing systems. So you might not have first-hand experience, but you can at least observe how people are doing it. I have a funny story here. When I was working at Pinterest much earlier in my career, there was someone who, we called him Dr. Wei. Dr. Wei was quite senior, and it was such a privilege to be able to work with him because he was the one actually architecting these systems for Pinterest scale, 100 million, 200 million users going through the system. And that was where I feel like I learned a lot about properly thinking about trade-offs and drawing boxes on a whiteboard, which I had never really done before. So my advice to you is that if you have someone like a Dr. Wei who you can interact with, work really hard to be in the room where you can see how they're designing systems. And eventually, if you're doing good at your job, you will have earned the trust to build your own system. And that's where you can start to understand system design at a deeper level and illustrate that in the interview.